Ladies and gentlemen, there are stories that shake our sense of who we are, stories that press against the walls of our assumptions and demand that we see humanity in places we never think to look. Some stories don't just inspire, they awaken something inside us that we had forgotten, that quiet, aching belief that goodness can come from the most unexpected corners of the world. Tonight, I want to tell you a story about such a moment. A story that begins with hunger, humility, and a question so small, so innocent, that it melted even the hardest hearts. It was a chilly afternoon, the kind that turns breath into mist and makes even the sun seem tired. A little girl, no more than 8 or 9, stood outside a roadside diner just off the highway. Her clothes were worn thin, her shoes too big for her feet, and her eyes, those deep, searching eyes, told the story of someone who had learned too early what it meant to be hungry. She wasn't begging loudly, nor did she carry a sign. She simply stood there, clutching the strap of her faded backpack, watching through the window as people laughed, ate, and lived their lives. Inside that diner, a group of bikers had just rolled in. The sound of their engines had rattled the windows. Black leather jackets, tattoos, steel chains, everything about them said trouble. The word, Hell's Angels, was stitched across their backs, the kind of sight that makes most people whisper or walk the other way. They filled the small diner with their laughter, rough and loud, ordering burgers, fries, and beer. Everyone else kept a careful distance. It wasn't that these men were bad, it was that the world had already decided who they were. Outside, the little girl stood patiently, her small hands trembling from the cold. When the waitress came out to dump the day's leftover bread into the trash, the girl took a shy step forward. "Sir," she said softly, though the waitress was a woman, her voice so timid that it barely rose above the sound of the wind. "Sir, can I have the leftover bread?" It was such a simple request. Just leftover bread, not a meal, not money, just what was about to be thrown away. And yet, it was enough to make every person who overheard it stop for a moment, because hunger, when spoken in a child's voice, pierces through all our layers of comfort. One of the bikers, a tall man with arms like iron and eyes that carried years of hard living, looked up from his plate. He had seen a lot in his life: wars, loss, fights, time in prison perhaps. But this sound of a hungry child asking for bread, it hit him somewhere he hadn't felt in a long time. He stood up slowly, his boots heavy on the floor, and the diner went silent. The waitress froze, unsure what he was about to do. People expected trouble, because that's what they thought men like him brought. But instead, he walked to the counter, pulled out his wallet, and said in a voice that was both gravel and kindness, "Pack her a meal. A real one, everything hot, and bring it quick." The waitress blinked, hesitated, and then nodded. The other bikers looked at each other, and one by one, they started adding to the order. "Get her some pie too," one said. "And a hot chocolate," added another. "She's freezing." Within moments, these men, the ones everyone avoided, the ones who looked like they belonged to a world of noise and danger, were pooling their money to feed a little girl they had never met. When the food was ready, the tall man took it himself. He stepped outside, crouched down to meet her eyes, and handed her the bag gently as though it were something sacred. "Here, sweetheart," he said. "You eat this while it's warm, okay?" The little girl stared at him in disbelief. No one had ever called her sweetheart like that before, not with that kind of tenderness. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Thank you, sir." And what happened next was the unthinkable. The biker took off his jacket, that heavy, leather jacket with the emblem everyone feared, and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Keep it," he said simply. "You look colder than I've ever been." Then he stood, turned to his brothers, and without another word, they all left their meals half finished, walked outside, started their bikes, and rode off into the setting sun. The rumble of their engines faded into the distance, but the echo of that act stayed long after. Inside the diner, nobody spoke for a long while. The waitress wiped her eyes. The manager, who had been ready to throw the girl out just moments earlier, couldn't look at anyone. And that little girl sat at a corner table, eating the warm food as tears rolled silently down her cheeks. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. Now, that story could end there, with a simple act of kindness, but it doesn't. Because years later, that same little girl, now grown, stood at a podium in a community hall, speaking to a crowd of volunteers. Her voice was strong, filled with the kind of purpose that only those who've known hunger can carry. She had started a foundation that fed thousands of children every week. And when someone asked her what inspired her, she smiled softly and said, "A group of men who the world called dangerous once gave me food, warmth, and dignity when no one else would. I learned that day that kindness doesn't wear a uniform. It rides in leather jackets sometimes. That, my friends, is the unthinkable. Not that they gave her bread, but that they gave her humanity." We live in a world quick to judge, don't we? We build walls of assumption, believing we can tell who's good or bad just by looking at their clothes, their tattoos, their hair, their past. But this story reminds us that love doesn't check credentials. Compassion doesn't need permission. And kindness, true kindness, often wears the face of those the world has already condemned. Think about it. How many times have we walked past someone in need because they didn't look like us, because their story seemed messy, or because we assumed it wasn't our place to help? How often do we forget that every person we meet carries a battle we cannot see? That behind every scar, every frown, every rough exterior, there might be a soul that once was tender, and still is, waiting for a reason to show it again. The Hell's Angels in that story didn't just feed a hungry child. They reclaimed something human in themselves. They broke the stereotype that defined them. They chose empathy over image. And that choice, my friends, is the foundation of all greatness. Because compassion is not weakness. It's power. The power to rewrite a story, to heal a wound, to change a life. And sometimes, all it takes to begin that change is a question whispered in hunger: "Sir, can I have the leftover bread?" That little question echoes through time, doesn't it? Because it isn't just about bread. It's about the leftover parts of ourselves we're willing to give, our leftover time, our leftover patience, our leftover love. We spend so much of life chasing what we can get, but maybe the true measure of our humanity is what we're willing to give away. When we give without expecting anything in return, something remarkable happens. We stop being defined by what we have, and we start being remembered for who we are. That biker didn't know his name would be remembered in a speech like this. He didn't do it for a camera, or for a headline. He did it because, in that moment, he saw himself in that little girl. He saw his own hunger, his own childhood, his own pain, and chose to answer it with love. There's something sacred in that. We often wait for the world to change before we show kindness. We think, once I'm rich, I'll give. Once I'm happy, I'll help. But the truth is, kindness isn't about timing. It's about seeing the need and saying, "Not on my watch." That's what those men did. And if men like that, men whom society had labeled as rough, unkind, dangerous, could stop and make room for a child's hunger, what excuse do the rest of us have? Kindness, real kindness, asks us to see the divine in the undeserving, the light in the broken, and the possibility in the forgotten. It asks us to believe that every person, no matter how far they've fallen, still has the power to do something beautiful. And you know what? That's what makes this story more than a story. It's a mirror held up to each of us, asking, when someone comes to you with trembling hands and hungry eyes, will you see a burden, or will you see a blessing? It's easy to give when it's convenient. It's easy to love when people are lovable. But the real test of our character is how we treat those who can give us nothing in return. There's a quote that says, "Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about." That day, those bikers saw a battle they understood: hunger, loneliness, cold, and they chose to fight it in the only way they could. That's what being human is all about. I've often thought about that jacket the man gave her. Heavy, worn, carrying the emblem that made people afraid. But on her small shoulders, it became something else: a shield, a symbol of warmth, of protection. Isn't that what kindness does? It transforms the very things we fear into instruments of love. Maybe that's the lesson. That the labels we wear, rich, poor, sinner, saint, outlaw, angel, don't define us as much as what we choose to do in moments of compassion. Maybe we all have a little bit of Hell's Angel in us, a part of us rough around the edges, misunderstood, but still capable of extraordinary kindness. Imagine what the world would look like if we all did the unthinkable more often. If we all reached out, Not when it's safe, but when it's hard. If we saw hunger and answered it, saw pain and eased it, saw loneliness and filled it. Imagine if, instead of judging, we listened. Instead of turning away, we knelt down and said, "Here, sweetheart. Eat this while it's warm." That's the world I want to live in. The truth is, inspiration doesn't come from perfection. It comes from people like those bikers, imperfect, flawed, and yet, profoundly human. It comes from the realization that even the hardest hearts can soften, that even the coldest nights can end with warmth, and that even the simplest acts can echo for generations. So, the next time life gives you a chance to do something good, even something small, do it. Don't hesitate. Don't calculate. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Because somewhere, someone is waiting for the leftover bread you didn't think mattered. Kindness is never wasted. It's like light. It doesn't diminish by being shared. The more we give, the brighter the world becomes. And maybe, years from now, someone will stand on a stage like this, telling your story, the story of how you did the unthinkable when no one else would. Because in the end, it's not about who we were. It's about who we became when love called our name. That little girl, that hungry, trembling child, she became a woman who believed in miracles because someone else decided to be one. And those bikers, those misunderstood men, they reminded the world that angels don't always have wings. Sometimes, they ride. So, if you take one thing from this story, let it be this: never underestimate the power of a small act. Never assume someone is beyond kindness. And never forget that a single meal, a single word, a single moment of compassion can ripple outward in ways you may never see. You may never know whose life you've changed. But change it you will. And when someone, somewhere, looks up and says, "Sir, can I have the leftover bread?" may you have the courage, the grace, and the love to do the unthinkable.